The organ music swelled, a majestic, hopeful sound that filled the sun-drenched sanctuary of St. Jude's Chapel. Light, fractured into a kaleidoscope of colors by the stained-glass windows, danced across the polished wooden pews and the faces of the assembled guests. It was a perfect day, the kind of day storybooks promised for moments like this. For Amelia, standing at the altar in a dress that had cost her 6 months of double shifts at the diner, it felt like a dream she was terrified to wake from. Her hands, hidden within the delicate lace of her sleeves, trembled. Not from joy, not entirely. It was a tremor born of a deep, persistent anxiety, a quiet voice that whispered she did not belong here. She looked out at the guests. On one side, her side, there were just 3 people. Her grandmother, Eleanor, whose frail hand was clutched in a white-knuckled grip around a worn handkerchief, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of pride. Beside her sat Mrs. Gable from the bakery, who had made the cake at a discount, and Mr. Henderson, the retired mailman who had always had a kind word for the orphan girl on his route. That was it. Her entire world, contained in a single pew. On the other side, a sea of expensive suits and couture dresses. The family of her groom, Mark Vancroft. They were a formidable dynasty of old money and quiet influence, their faces etched with a polite, but palpable, condescension. Amelia had felt their judgment from the moment Mark had brought her home, a wildflower plucked from the roadside and presented in a crystal vase. They saw her as a project, a temporary infatuation for their golden boy son. Their smiles were thin, their eyes cold. They had made it clear, in 100 subtle ways, that she was not, and never would be, one of them. But Mark had promised. He had sworn their love was stronger than his family's prejudice. He had held her face in his hands and told her that she was the only thing that felt real in his gilded, hollow life. She had believed him. She had clung to that belief like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. It was her salvation, her ticket out of a life of just getting by, of worrying about the heating bill and the cost of Eleanor's medicine. It was the promise of a family she had never had. The music softened. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church swung open. And there he was. Mark. He looked impossibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his blonde hair catching the light like a halo. But as he walked down the aisle, his eyes met hers, and the fragile dream inside her began to fracture. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was only a chilling, distant apology. A panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her hope. He reached the altar and took his place opposite her. The minister, a kind-faced man named Father Michael, smiled warmly. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice a gentle baritone that was meant to soothe. But nothing could soothe the icy dread coiling in Amelia's stomach. Mark wouldn't look at her. He stared fixedly at a point just over her shoulder, his jaw tight. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Mark Vancroft and Amelia Rosewood in holy matrimony." Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the church, the expectant smiles, the rustle of clothing. She tried to catch Mark's eye again, a silent, desperate plea. "Please. Look at me. Tell me it's all right." He finally did. And in his eyes, she saw it all. The cowardice. The regret. The end. Father Michael continued, "If anyone can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A suffocating silence descended upon the church. It was the traditional, theatrical pause. But this time, it felt different. It felt heavy, final. And then, a voice cut through it. "I can," Mark said. A collective gasp swept through the pews. The air crackled with shock. Father Michael's smile faltered, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Son." Mark took a small step back, away from her. The distance felt like a chasm opening between them. He finally looked directly at Amelia, and his expression was one of profound, pathetic pity. "I'm sorry, Amelia. I can't do this. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed from Amelia's lungs. The world tilted, the colors of the stained glass bleeding together into a meaningless blur. She could hear the whispers erupting, a sibilant tide of scandal and speculation rising from the Vancroft side of the aisle. Her own small corner was deathly silent. "Mark, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice a thread of sound, barely audible. He shook his head, refusing to meet her gaze again. He turned to his parents. His father, a man with a face like a clenched fist, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of approval. His mother's expression was one of cool, triumphant relief. They had won. "I can't marry you," Mark said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength, as if bolstered by his family's approval. They were right. This was a mistake. We're from different worlds. It would never have worked. Different worlds. The words he had once used to describe the magic of their connection, how she had shown him a world of simple, honest joys he'd never known. Now he used them as a weapon, a final, clean severance. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked away. Down the aisle, past the shocked faces, past the wilting flowers, past everything they were supposed to have built together. His father stood, a silent sentinel, and then followed him. His mother rose with an air of theatrical sorrow, dabbing at a dry eye with a silk handkerchief before sweeping down the aisle, herding her family out like a shepherdess of the damned. Within minutes, the Vancroft side of the church was empty. They fled as if from a contagion, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the deafening echo of their cruelty. Amelia stood alone at the altar. She was a statue carved from humiliation. The beautiful dress felt like a costume of mockery. The veil was a shroud. Her bouquet of white roses trembled, and one perfect bloom fell to the floor. The sound of its soft landing was like a gunshot in the crushing silence. Father Michael stepped forward, his face a mask of distress. "Amelia, my child," he didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. She saw her grandmother, Eleanor, being helped to her feet by Mrs. Gable. Eleanor's face was ashen, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that seemed too immense for her small frame. Their eyes met across the empty church, and that was when Amelia's own tears finally came. Not a delicate trickle, but a raw, silent cascade of grief. She had been so close. So close to having a family. So close to being safe. Now, she was just the poor girl from the diner, the town charity case, left at the altar. The story would be all over their small town by nightfall. The pitying looks, the whispers, it would follow her for years. She sank to her knees, the heavy satin of her dress pooling around her like a fallen cloud. She didn't register Father Michael kneeling beside her, or Mrs. Gable rushing up the aisle. All she felt was a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the stone floor. It was a cold that sank deep into the bones, the desolate chill of absolute loneliness. Her mind, in a desperate attempt to escape the present agony, fled to the past. To another cold night, months ago. A night that had felt insignificant then, but now seemed like a beacon from a different life. It had been a Tuesday in late January, the kind of night where the wind howled with a special kind of malice, rattling the windows of the Morning Glory diner. It was 10 minutes to close, and Amelia was wiping down the last of the sticky counters, her body aching from a 10-hour shift. The bell over the door had chimed, startling her. A man stood there, shaking the wet snow from a worn leather jacket. He was huge, a mountain of a man with a wild, gray-streaked beard and arms covered in faded, intricate tattoos. He looked tired. Not just tired from the road, but a deeper, soul-deep weariness she recognized. It was the exhaustion of fighting a battle no one else could see. He eased his large frame onto a stool at the counter, moving with the stiff grace of someone who lived with constant pain. He didn't look like trouble. He looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, which were slumped like mountains worn down by time. "Kitchen's closed," she said softly, not unkindly. "But I can get you some coffee." Maybe a piece of pie. He nodded, his eyes scanning the empty diner. Coffee's fine, he'd rumbled, his voice rough like gravel. She poured him a mug, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. He wrapped his big, calloused hands around it, letting the warmth seep into his skin. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the humming of the refrigerator and the wind screaming outside. "Where you headed?" she asked, breaking the quiet. "North," he said, not elaborating. He took a long sip of coffee. "Just came from Arlington." Amelia understood. Arlington meant a funeral. It meant a fallen brother. It explained the profound sadness in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and seemed surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. He just nodded again, a muscle twitching in his jaw. She saw a flicker of something behind the intimidating facade, not weakness, but a raw, unguarded pain. She turned away, busying herself. She cut him the largest piece of apple pie, slid it in front of him, and then went back to the grill. She fired it up without a word. The smell of sizzling bacon and frying eggs soon filled the small space, a comforting, homely aroma that fought back against the cold of the night. She placed a heaping plate in front of him. Bacon, eggs, hash browns, toast. A proper meal. He stared at the plate, then up at her, his brow furrowed. "I didn't order this." "I know," she said. "But you look like you need it more than I need to go home on time." He ate. He ate like a man who hadn't had a real meal in days. He didn't speak again until the plate was clean. He pushed it away, took another long drink of coffee, and then reached for his back pocket. He fumbled for a moment, and his face changed. The weariness was replaced by a flash of shame. He started, his voice low. "I seem to have lost my wallet. Or, it's gone. I paid for gas 100 miles back," he trailed off, looking embarrassed. Mortified. This giant of a man, humbled by an empty pocket. Amelia just smiled gently. She took the check she had written out of habit and tore it in half. "Don't worry about it." "No," he said, his voice firm. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," she replied, her voice just as firm. She leaned forward slightly. "My grandma says when you can help, you help. It's not a handout. It's neighborly. And right now, you look like you need a neighbor." She pulled a crumpled $20 bill from her apron pocket, her tips for the day, money she needed for groceries. She slid it across the counter toward him. "For gas. To get you where you're going." He stared at the money, then at her, his eyes unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. He looked at her small, determined face, at the kindness that asked for nothing in return. Finally, he pushed the 20 back toward her. "I can't take your money. But the meal. I won't forget it." He stood up, his large frame seeming to fill the entire diner. "What's your name?" "Amelia." "Amelia," he repeated, the name a low rumble in his chest. He looked at the patch on his leather vest. It depicted a bald eagle in front of a steel cross, with the words, "Iron Sentinels MC," stitched around it. "My name is Bear. And the Iron Sentinels always pay their debts." He gave her a long, searching look, then turned and walked out into the storm. She watched him go, then locked the door, feeling the loss of the $20 but also a strange, quiet warmth in her chest. An act of kindness, sent out into the world. She never expected to see him again. She had forgotten all about it. Until now. A sound. It started as a low, deep vibration, a thrumming that seemed to come from the stone floor itself. Amelia, still kneeling in her ruined wedding dress, lifted her head. Father Michael paused, his hand hovering over her shoulder. Eleanor, by the pews, looked toward the church doors, her brow furrowed. It was a low rumble, like distant thunder on a clear day. But it didn't fade. It grew. Steadily, relentlessly, it swelled from a rumble to a roar. The stained-glass windows, depicting serene saints and peaceful doves, began to vibrate in their lead casings, emitting a low, buzzing hum. The roar grew louder still, becoming a physical presence. It was the sound of 1,000 angry hornets, a tidal wave of internal combustion. It wasn't just one engine, it was dozens, then hundreds, a deafening chorus of raw power that shook the very foundations of the old church. Mrs. Gable, her face pale, scurried to a side window and peeked through the curtain. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Oh, my heavens! Outside, the world had been transformed. The quiet, tree-lined street in front of the church was gone. In its place was a river. A river of chrome and black leather, a churning, roaring torrent of steel that stretched from one end of the block to the other, and beyond. Motorcycles. Hundreds of them. They were parked in disciplined rows that filled the entire street, curb to curb. Harleys, Indians, custom choppers, their engines idled in a unified, ground-shaking symphony. Men in leather vests, their faces weathered and bearded, sat astride the machines, their expressions grim and unreadable. On their backs, every single one of them wore the same patch, a bald eagle before a steel cross. The Iron Sentinels. The few remaining guests and townspeople who had lingered to gossip or offer condolences were frozen on the church steps, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. Doors along the street were being locked. Curtains were twitched aside by frightened eyes. Mark and his father, who had been about to get into their sleek, black sedan to make their escape, were trapped. They stood by their car, pale and motionless, staring at the impossible army that had materialized from nowhere. The roar of the engines suddenly cut out. In perfect, practiced unison, they went silent. The abrupt absence of sound was even more shocking than the noise itself. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the street, broken only by the nervous chirping of a bird in a nearby tree. Then, from the center of the vast formation, one man dismounted. He moved with a purpose that parted the sea of bikers. He was a mountain of a man, with a gray-streaked beard and a familiar, weary strength in his shoulders. It was Bear. He wore his leather vest, the Iron Sentinel's patch displayed proudly on his back. He walked not with aggression, but with an unshakable authority. He ignored the terrified onlookers. He ignored Mark and his father. His gaze was fixed on one thing, the open doors of the church. He walked up the stone steps and into the sanctuary. His heavy boots echoed on the marble floor, a slow, deliberate rhythm that counted down to a reckoning. He walked down the central aisle, his eyes scanning the scene, the empty pews on one side, the small, huddled group of three on the other, and the girl in the white dress, kneeling at the altar like a fallen angel. He stopped a few feet from her. Amelia looked up, her tear-streaked face a canvas of confusion and shock. She saw the giant man from the diner, the man she had fed on a cold winter's night. She saw the weariness in his eyes, but today it was overlaid with something else. A protective fire. A righteous anger. He knelt down, a difficult, deliberate motion for a man his size, so that his eyes were level with hers. His voice, when he spoke, was the same gravelly rumble she remembered, but it was softened with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. "Amelia," he said. She could only stare, speechless. "I told you," he continued, his voice low so only she and the few people near them could hear. "The Iron Sentinels always pay their debts. One of our scouts was in town setting up for a rally. He heard what was happening. He called me. He reached into his vest and pulled out a simple, worn leather wallet. I didn't lose this. It was stolen. At a truck stop a few hours before I met you. I'd just come from burying my best friend. My brother. I had nothing. I was broken. And you, a complete stranger, showed me a kindness I thought had disappeared from this world. You fed a brother when he was down. You offered him your last dollar." His gaze was intense, unwavering. That's not a small thing, Amelia. To us, that's everything. That act made you family. And we take care of our family. He rose to his full, intimidating height and turned to face the cavernous, empty space of the church. He gestured with his head toward the door, and two more bikers, equally large, walked in. One was carrying a heavy, steel briefcase. They flanked Bear, standing like stone guards. Bear's voice boomed, no longer gentle, but filled with a commanding power that resonated to the back walls. "We're here to settle a debt," he announced. He looked at Amelia's grandmother, his expression softening for a moment. "Ma'am, I understand your granddaughter and you paid for this entire event. Is that correct?" Eleanor, her fear momentarily forgotten, nodded numbly. "Every penny we had." Bear nodded grimly. He gestured to the briefcase. The biker holding it snapped it open. The sight caused another collective gasp from the few who remained. It was filled with neat stacks of cash. "The price of one meal, given in honor and compassion, is priceless," Bear declared, his voice ringing with authority. "But we're going to do our best to put a number on it. We're repaying every dime you spent. And we're doubling it, for the pain and humiliation this scum has caused you." He took the briefcase himself and walked to Amelia. He held it out to her. "This is yours. No strings. A debt, paid in full." Amelia stared at the money, then back at his face. She slowly shook her head. I can't take that." "It's not a request," Bear said, his voice firm but not unkind. He placed the heavy case on the floor beside her. Then, he turned. His eyes, like chips of granite, settled on the church entrance, where Mark and his father were still standing, paralyzed. A slow, predatory calm came over Bear's features. He started walking down the aisle toward them, his boots echoing like a judge's gavel. The 200 bikers outside, as if on some silent cue, dismounted from their bikes. They formed a silent, menacing wall that blocked any chance of escape. Bear stopped directly in front of Mark's father, a man used to wielding power from boardrooms and country clubs. For the first time in his life, Mr. Vancroft looked small. He looked afraid. "You," Bear said, his voice a low growl. "You're the one who taught this boy that a woman's heart is something to be broken for sport. That honor is something you can buy and sell." Vancroft Sr. puffed out his chest, a pathetic attempt at bravado. "I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right. I am the man who knows that half of the contracts for your construction empire are with state and federal agencies." Bear cut him off, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know that a significant portion of your workforce, from the welders to the drivers to the foremen, are veterans. Men like us. Men who value loyalty and honor above all else." He leaned in closer, his sheer size casting Vancroft in shadow. "And I know that news travels fast. News about a wealthy man who thinks it's acceptable for his son to publicly humiliate a good, hard-working woman. A woman who showed more honor in giving a stranger a free meal than your family has shown in its entire lineage." Vancroft's face went from red to a pasty white. The implications were clear. This wasn't a physical threat. It was something far worse. It was the threat of total, systemic ruin. Strikes. Walkouts. Cancelled contracts. A reputation shattered beyond repair. "Word is going to get out," Bear continued, his voice a silken threat. "It's going to get out to every union hall, every VFW post, and every job site from here to the coast. The word will be that Vancroft Sr. is a man without honor. And his son," he flicked his eyes to Mark, who flinched as if struck, "is a coward who breaks his word. Nobody wants to work for a man like that. Nobody wants to do business with a man like that." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Your empire is built on the backs of men who believe in the principles you just spat on. By tomorrow morning, those backs are going to start walking away. You're ruined. You just don't know it yet." Bear straightened up, dismissing them as if they were insects. He turned his back on them completely and walked back to Amelia. She had risen to her feet, helped by her grandmother. She looked at the briefcase full of money, then at the man who had brought this unbelievable justice to her doorstep. The tears in her eyes now were not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, staggering gratitude. "I don't want the money," she said again, her voice stronger now. "What you've done, that's enough." "It's more than enough," she looked at Bear, her gaze clear and steady. "But if you insist, then I don't want it for me. There's a veterans fund in town, for those struggling to get by. And the senior center needs a new roof. Use it for that. Please." A profound respect dawned in Bear's eyes. He looked at this slight, gentle woman in her wedding dress, who, even after being shattered, thought only of helping others. He saw in her the same pure, unshakable core of goodness that had moved him so deeply in the diner that night. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "It will be done." He looked at her, then at Mark, who was watching this exchange with a look of dawning horror, finally realizing not just what he had lost, but who he had lost. Amelia met his gaze for a final time. There was no hatred in her eyes. No love, no sorrow. There was only a calm, quiet finality. She had seen his soul, and it was empty. She turned away from him for the last time. Bear addressed his men at the door. "The debt is paid," he roared. He turned back to Amelia. "You ever need anything at all, you know who we are. You are under the protection of the Iron Sentinels. No one will ever harm you again." He gave her a respectful nod, a gesture of a soldier saluting a queen. Then he turned and walked down the aisle, his boots marking his departure. As he stepped out into the sunlight, a single, unified command was given. 200 engines roared to life at once, a thunderous, triumphant salute that shook the heavens. It was not a sound of menace anymore. It was a hymn of loyalty. An anthem of honor. In perfect, disciplined formation, the river of steel began to move. They flowed down the street and out of town, their engines a receding thunder, leaving behind a stunned silence and a world forever changed. Amelia stood on the steps of the church, her grandmother's hand in hers, watching them go. The wedding dress no longer felt like a costume of shame. It felt like armor. It was the uniform she wore on the day she wasn't abandoned, but found. The day her tiny, fractured family of 3 became a family of hundreds. She was not the girl who was left at the altar. She was the woman who had fed a king in disguise, and who, in her darkest hour, was saved by his army. The world wasn't just cruel, after all. It was also filled with a fierce, unwavering, and honorable light, sometimes found in the most unexpected of places. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt truly, completely safe. Paid in full.